Hey, everybody. The TLC plan for episcopacy is a topic that has drawn the ire and attention of many within the Global Methodist Church. I'm a Global Methodist pastor, so I'm obviously interested in this. I've been talking a lot about things pertaining to the Convening Conference that's gathering in a couple weeks for the Global Methodist Church. I've actually been going through all the petitions as I'm able every morning on a live stream from 7:30 to 8:30. You might consider joining me if you're interested in that kind of nerdy stuff. Surprisingly, there's a lot of people that are a part of it. So anyway, if that interests you, then you're going to be very interested in this conversation as well. And even if you're not a part of what the GMC is doing in particular, Reverend Dr. Matt O'Reilly is a theologically astute, historically informed, doctrinally robust conversation partner. He's the guy I'm talking to today. And we're talking about the episcopacy, and we're going to be talking about the framework of the TLC plan, called the Superintendency model. A couple weeks ago, I interviewed Jay Therrell, who is putting forth the hybrid model or the residential bishop model. It's called different things, but his stands in contradistinction to the model that we're talking about today. Today is the model provided by the Transitional Leadership Committee, which is the small group that's been leading the whole denomination thus far. It's made a series of petitions, submitted a series of petitions, not just pertaining to the episcopacy, but a number of things. But the episcopacy is a big part of it. And for those who don't know the weight of this, the United Methodist Church, which most of us came out of, was very dysfunctional in the end. And the episcopacy was the place where you could just see that most plainly. Even today, the denomination continues. And yesterday, they just by fiat, they announced a huge multi-million-dollar gathering that nobody gets elected to, that they're just going to nominate in 2026. So hopefully I'll be talking with the considering Charlotte crew about it. But it's just a dysfunctional thing in the United Methodist model, but it's also a historical and biblical thing that we can't really not do. So given that the episcopacy, or bishops, is something that the Global Methodist Church really has to do, functionally and biblically, how can we do it and not reproduce the misery and dysfunction of where we came from? That's the conversation underlying all of this. And a lot of different leading voices agree about some stuff and disagree about some other stuff. And I'm just going to wade into it like a moron because somebody has to. And so hopefully it's going to be really beneficial for you. Well, it's going to be beneficial for you. You're dealing with Matt in this time. And if you don't know who he is, this is Matt O'Reilly, and he's recently published a book on holiness that we're going to talk about briefly, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time on the TLC plan. So, Matt, how did I do setting all this up for those listening? Are there any other things you think they should keep in mind as they listen to you and me?
No, I think the conversation will do what it needs to do to clarify two very, very different plans and visions for the role and work of bishops. So set that up nicely.
Well, thanks, brother.
Have that conversation.
Well, and viewers should know I've already talked with Matt on a more personal level. We had an interview, I don't know, about a year ago. And so if you haven't met Matt before, but you're interested to learn how his brain works, I would point you towards that interview. But also, he has his own online ministry called Theology Project, where he's generated a lot of good theological material as well. So make sure to follow that. But let's look first, me and you, Matt. You recently came out with a book. It's called Free to Be Holy. It's sold on Seedbed. And it's right here, and you'll see you get a bigger discount the more that you order. And you actually did
buy a lot of copies.
Yeah, you have to buy a lot of copies, yes. And they actually did an interview with you, kind of talking about how you understand the nature of holiness biblically, doctrinally. I was able to read this, and I actually found it really helpful. So I would like for people to, I took note when Ryan Danker called the Wesleyan Institute, I forget which group it is together, but they met for several days, many leading scholars. I don't know if you were part of it or not. If not, you should. Oh, you were. Okay, so it was on the topic of holiness. And
that's right.
Danker is now compiling all of that together, and it'll be published someday. But in the meantime, you're riding this wave too. So for those who are interested in Methodism, the distinctively Methodist way of understanding holiness, you have this great interview here that I'm going to put a link to in the show notes. But why do you think that this particular topic is relevant and important at this juncture in history?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are in the midst with this thing that we're calling the next Methodism, and which is bigger than the Global Methodist Church. The Pan-Wesleyan movement is one of the terms you'll hear, where our identity as the people who are marked by this distinctive understanding of salvation that includes an expansive understanding of holiness throughout the Christian life. We're recovering that. Holiness is having its day, so to speak. It's being recovered amongst the people called Methodists. And that's important because if you study the history of Methodism and you go back and look at the earliest Methodists and ask the question, how did they understand themselves? What was their sense of mission? What was their priority? The way they answered that question, why did God raise up the Methodists? The way they answered that question was to say that God raised up the Methodists to reform the nation, especially the church, and then specifically to spread scriptural holiness across the land. And so this book takes its place in the larger movement as attempting to help us recover something we've lost. So the United Methodist Church, even in the best churches, was not a place where you would hear a lot about scriptural holiness. We've got lots of strong churches, but it just wasn't a part of our vocabulary the way it has been historically in Methodism. And so you've got a lot of work that's trying to bring that back. You mentioned Ryan Denker and the John Wesley Institute. I was a part of a group of 60, 70 scholars and pastors and church leaders that gathered in Washington, D.C. earlier this year in January to write kind of an ecumenical document on holiness that will be published by Seedbed. That's a follow-up to the one we did a couple of years before called The Faith Once Delivered, which was West salvation as a whole. The new one focuses on holiness specifically. You got books like Kevin Watson's Perfect Love. You got podcasts like The Art of Holiness. There's just a lot of this kind of language that's being recovered, and this book is part of that.
Yeah, Art of Holiness, that's Carolyn Moore?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a percolating conversation that is pretty worthy and important. So just briefly, and then we'll get to the episcopacy. We are kind of at a juncture right now when we are trying to have the conversation of what does the name title Methodist mean, and where are the boundaries on that? I kind of capitalize in being plain spoken and saying kind of the quiet part out loud. And I wonder how much clarity there is on your part and a more consensus opinion on the part of those who swim in the same waters that you're in. I would be willing to say that if a person considers themselves a Methodist, but they're not interested in holiness, that they are confused and they are not actually a Methodist, that this is something that's so core and key to Methodism that it's really not negotiable. Do you, and those who were a part of the John Wesley Institute, do you feel like y'all had that same clarity, or do you feel like there's perhaps a broadening of the image of what Methodism is, and maybe there is room for churches and people in our churches that are not particularly interested in holiness?
Yeah, so when you're thinking about identity, you think about what's essential and what's distinctive. And so there are lots of Methodist essentials that connect us with the larger, broader Orthodox Christian tradition. And then there are some things that are distinctive to us, and the emphasis on entire sanctification is one of those. And so without the distinctions, it's hard to tell the difference between one Christian denomination or tradition and another. And so, yeah, those distinctives are essential. They really matter, essential to the identity. They really matter. They help us understand what our contribution is to the larger Christian tradition and the discussion over doctrine. And I would say if someone's Methodist, if you're in a Methodist church and you don't understand holiness or you're not quite interested in it, then you need to, it's worth spending some time reflecting on that crucial aspect of our tradition. It is a distinctive, essential identity marker. And, there's some shepherding that needs to happen because of what I said a moment ago, where holiness wasn't common language in the United Methodist Church. We can't just sort of say, well, you don't believe it, you're not one of us, because there's the flock hasn't been shepherded well in that way, and it needs to be shepherded well, and that's going to be a process. I mean, I've gone into churches and started talking about holiness, and the response was, we've never even heard this language before.
Right.
Like, they love Jesus, Yeah, they're committed to Methodism as a movement, but they just haven't been exposed to that aspect of our tradition. And so our job is to sort of say, well, like let's dig into this. Let's not just dig into the tradition, but let's dig into the scriptures, which is what Free to Be
Exactly.
Holy is about. Free to Be
Okay,
Holy
great.
is it's a biblical case for exegetical underpinnings of a Wesleyan understanding of holiness.
Very much needed for this present moment. So thank you for doing that. I'm very much, that is one of the things that becomes clear when you read early Methodist writings. You just go, they were much more concerned about holiness than we are. We've really shifted in our priorities. So I've very much appreciated voices like yours calling us home. So let's go ahead and transition now to the TLC episcopacy model. And then you go whatever direction you want to. You can whip us back wherever you want. But you sent me a presentation that I've now got before you and the audience, and you just lead us through at your leisure, and I'll ask any clarifying questions along the way.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, as you're heading over to the first slide, let me say just this as a preface. This is probably one of the first major debates. Maybe it's a point of tension in this newly formed Global Methodist Church, where we have alternative plans and we've got folks who feel strongly about the different plans. And I just want to say we need to understand that this debate is not the kind of debate we had in our last ecclesial home, right? This is not a debate over what's essential to the Christian faith. This is a debate over how we're going to order ourselves, and it's a debate among friends. It's a conversation among folks who are committed to the same ultimate goals. And so I think I really try to come into this conversation with a posture of trust. In the articles I've written on my website, I've attempted to interact with ideas without criticizing people as much as I could.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I disagree with some folks on what the episcopacy should look like, but I still want to. I don't think they have ill motives. I don't think they're trying to, manipulate the system. We just need to spend some time reflecting on this with a basic posture of trust that we can engage this conversation and hopefully move forward. We've been so ingrained with distrust in debate that we're going to have to be extra careful to make sure that tone doesn't come into this discussion.
So you published 4 articles, actually, that I was able to read 2 of them. And in the second one, you were very clear. J. Therrell is one of those lifting up the other plan. He's probably the main figure, but you bear no ill will. You consider this a conversation among friends. And that's the exact same disposition that he had whenever he spoke to me. So I actually haven't encountered anyone, and I would hope that I would have never been seen as a person going, oh, they have ill motives here. So I'm
not pointing at anybody. It's not a sub-tweet kind of vibe. I just have this sense that, especially going into the debate at General Conference, like it's when you've had a debate with a certain tone for 40 years, there's a lot of habits to unlearn.
Yeah.
And I've listened to your conversation with Jay several times, just anticipating this. Want to be sure I understood the position as clear as possible. And I really did appreciate his tone. So Jay, watching, I appreciate that tone of kind of charity and good-natured, good-hearted approach to the church.
And we're definitely going to have that here and now. The thing about, I'm having a larger conversation about trust, and I think it's unhelpful even when you're dealing with bad partners, even in the UMC. It's just never helpful to go, they're only saying this because they want X, Y, or Z, or here's their inner motivations that I'm going to pretend I have access to. We don't have access to that. But what we do know is all of us are limited, that we're recovering from this fallen nature, and the Holy Spirit hasn't entirely sanctified many of us. We're still very lacking in our understanding. Many of us haven't done a lot of the biblical and historical research. And so as we approach conversations like this, then it's not a sin to say, hey, show me your work. I need to see how you got there from here. Help me follow along with you, engage these other ideas, and none of that should be threatening to those who are in authority. So when we do this kind of examination and ask these questions, it's not because we don't trust each other. It's because trust has to be earned, firstly, but secondly, just because you trust somebody doesn't mean they're right. And so that's why we're able to tread this ground together, and egos aren't at stake.
That's right.
And I should also say, you're not doing this as a representative of the TLC that formulated this plan. Rather, you're just a person in church leadership who likes it, and it needs to be advocated for and better understood. So in that capacity, you can lead us through.
That's great. Thanks so much. Yeah, well, let's flip over to the next one there. We are in the way.
I was here. I'm
I tell you,
yeah, there we go.
It's good. I'm not sure.
I'll just move myself around as needed.
You're flexible. That's cool. Yeah, so I think it's just helpful to know a little bit of background. There's two plans. One is has frequently been called the TLC plan, or the General Superintendency Plan, or the Traveling Bishops Plan. That's the one that I'm sort of presenting on and talking about. And then the alternative is the Florida plan, or the hybrid model, those kinds of, or the residential bishops plan. We can talk more about that distinction later.
Okay.
I think TLC plan, it's not wrong, but it's not the most accurate way to describe what the General Superintendency Plan, because the plan had a life long before the TLC wrote and submitted the legislation. So before the TLC sort of endorsed this, there was a task force on the nature of the episcopacy that worked for, I think, 6 months, exploring like what the episcopacies looked like in Methodism. I think they discovered somewhere along the way that residential bishops only became a thing in Methodism in 1939, right? So we've had bishops for a long time, but they haven't been residential the whole time. And so there's a lot
by residential, you mean that instead of itinerating, they just stay in one place and everything orbits around them. So you're saying historically that was not a thing until Methodism.
My understanding is it came along. No. My understanding is historically Methodists have had itinerant traveling bishops.
There you go. Superintendency, I think, is what you wanted to say, not residential.
Well, let me clarify. So when Francis Asbury started bishoping in America, he traveled all over the country, right?
Right.
He was an itinerant traveling bishop, and the general superintendents, or the bishops, continued that way for a very, very long time. And it wasn't until 1939 that we started locating bishops in annual conference residentially.
Okay.
So that's the decision that I'm making.
Okay.
The historians can check me on the dates. That's my understanding of it. And there, if folks want a historical perspective on this, Bishop Scott Jones gave a talk at our Reconstructing Methodism conference on this very topic, where he gave kind of a historical vision of the general superintendency traveling itinerant bishops, grounded in the ministry of Francis Asbury himself. So that talk is on Theology Project YouTube channel, or you can grab Reconstructing Methodism, the book that's just come out with Francis Asbury Press. And there's lots of really helpful stuff on how Methodists have historically done bishops. And so the point is, this thing had a study group before it came to TLC legislation. And so the TLC took the results of that task force and the work that they had done and crafted what's now called the General Superintendency model or plan, based on the findings of that task force on the episcopacy.
So I understand both current plans. So the TLC plan took the work of the episcopacy task force. It did tweak some things. It didn't carry forward all the recommendations. It did make some differences. But then similarly, the Florida plan was based on the WCA write-up that was adopted in the early versions of the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Disciplines. So both of these models have precursors that were well thought out and then fleshed out over time. And neither of them are the reflection of unique work done by the bodies now recommending them. So I think that is helpful.
It is helpful. And it's a good reminder, too, that this isn't like a quick decision that's being made.
Right.
We've been in a discernment process on what this is going to look like for years, going back to the WCA draft, prospective doctrines and discipline, to the task force, and now we've got these two plans. So that's good. That means we've had a long time to think about it and kind of let it simmer, and now we're getting ready to make a decision.
That's exactly right. You ready for the next one?
Let's do it.
Oh,
All right.
And we are in the
See,
way. My bad.
you might do better to be up in that top right corner. You might both ought to be, because the
Okay. Yeah, here we
titles are the
go.
least important part. Put us up there. Move me up there too. That would probably be good.
My mouse is killing me.
Oh,
So
no. I'm
here,
sorry.
just go ahead and lead, and I will figure things out awkwardly, and everybody will pretend it's great.
I think you're good right there. That looks good if you stick it there.
Here we go.
Yeah, so I think the goals of the program and are in some ways, if you've listened to Jay's presentations, the goals of both plans are the thing that's similar, in that the question is, which plan is the best one for getting to those goals. So I think this is really helpful. We have a shared sense of outcome. Like, we all want to minimize the potential for a top-heavy institution. We don't want kind of the general church level being the thing that drives the movement. We want local churches driving the movement. So I tend to think the general superintendency plan is the best way to minimize the potential for a top-heavy institution. And then I think it also provides maximum flexibility for annual conferences, in that you have the opportunity for most of your conference administration to be done by folks who've grown up in the conference, right? Under the general superintendency plan, each conference will have a conference superintendent. My understanding is that could be a part-time or a full-time role. There are multiple annual conferences right now that have kept a part-time president pro tem, which decreases cost for them. That person is in a local church, pastoring. A part-time president pro tem is pastoring a local church. So they're not, one of the problems we ran into in the UMC is, you'd have bishops who like, I had one bishop in Alabama, West Florida, who hadn't pastored a church in 12 years. Right? He had been a DS for a period, like maybe 8 years, 6 years, 8 years. And before that, or after that, I forget which order came in, he was the assistant to the bishop for 4 years. So it was like 8 years is one and 4 years is the other. And so here's a person who is the residential bishop of an annual conference who hasn't actually pastored a local church for more than a decade. So I think the conference superintendent plan in the general superintendency model gives us folks who have been in the local church. If they're full-time, they've been in the local church as pastors immediately preceding that. And if they're part-time, they're still in the church as local pastors. And so your conference admin is not divorced from the life of the local church.
As divorced, yeah. I mean, there's always going to be some, how much time are you spending in each world? But even so, this is much closer to the bottom. For those who are watching, there's terminology that we're throwing out that I'm just going to make sure that you follow. We have annual conferences that correspond, if you look at the United States, they correspond to states pretty much. And right now, they are overseen by a primary administrator called the president pro tempore. And we have two bishops that are general superintendents traveling around the global connection. What we're talking about here in the TLC model is continuing to have the president pro tempore position, but it's now called the conference superintendent. So they would be like a state governor. But then they report to the president, only we would have multiple presidents, and they're moving around all the time. And that would be the bishops. So this is a messy model. Don't get turned off by the political stuff. So when we're talking about the Florida plan is states' rights, everything stays pretty contained. Each state has its own governor. And that maintains here, except there is also a general superintendent that's responsible for 4 to 6 annual conferences, and they travel around that connection. They speak for well, we'll cover a lot of the different facets there. But what Dr. O'Reilly is arguing is that this provides for skeleton crew leadership. We're not a bloated, heavy institution at the top like the UMC was. It's still very responsive and flexible. The people leading on the conference level are much closer to the local church, culturally, practically, than we have seen. All good things. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to point out one of the flexibility is related to the financial piece too, right? So this is the last point there. So one of the critiques that the Florida plan advocates of the Florida plan makes, I think Jay made this point when he was on your podcast, was the general superintendency creates an Episcopal fund at the general church level, And that means all the conferences pay into that, or all the churches pay into it through their general church connectional funding. And his point was, if you have a bishop go rogue, if we fund it at the general church and a bishop goes rogue, then everybody is participating in the salary of that bishop.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a problem in the UMC.
Oh yeah.
I don't think respectfully, I don't think that's as big of a problem as Jay thinks it is. And the reason I think that is because of the accountability measures that we're building in. So here's the thing: if we have rogue bishops and we can't get rid of them quickly, then we're doing it wrong.
Right.
Yeah. So if a bishop goes off the reservation and commits heresy or starts leading us in a direction that we don't want to go, and conferences are saying, well, we're frustrated because we're continually having to participate in the salary of that bishop,
right,
and we can't move them out and take their salary away quickly,
mm-hmm.
then we've built the thing in the wrong way. And
well,
so
yes.
I'm fine with a general church episcopacy fund, because we're building appropriate accountability into the plan.
Well, that was one of the things he characterized the TLC plan. I'm sorry, the Superintendency Plan as foxes guarding the hen house, because I'm
coming to that later.
Oh, you will? Okay. Then I'll remember that, and I'll pick back up on that.
Yeah. There's a slide later on perfecting the general superintendency plan. There's like 3 things at least that need to happen to make it as best as it can be.
Okay.
Yeah. So with the right accountability structures, a general church Episcopal fund is not a problem, and it's actually a benefit for this reason, in my view. So local church general church connectional funding is capped in the discipline at 1.5%. Right now, it's at 1%. They can raise it 0.5%, and if they were, and whether it's at 1 or 1.5, the general church has to run its budget with that cap. It doesn't get raised.
Okay.
So if we build in this general superintendency plan and fund it at the level of the general church, your local church giving cannot increase more than 0.5% in order to fund bishops.
Ever, unless there's an amendment.
Unless we change the discipline.
Yeah.
And that seems incredibly unlikely to me, because everybody wants an inexpensive GMC.
Yeah.
Right. So at the bottom line, if dollars and cents matter to you, because I've heard, the point has been made, well, general superintendency is more expensive than residential bishops. That doesn't quite make sense to me, but put that aside. The most the general superintendency plan could possibly cost your church is 0.5% of your non-capital expenditures. That's it. It's capped. There's no more. The residential bishop plan, the Florida plan, is funded at the level of the annual conference.
Mm-hmm.
And annual conference connectional giving or connectional funding is capped at 5%.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So right now in North Alabama, we're getting ready to go to 2%. We've been at 1. We're getting ready to go to 2. Some conferences are at 3. For us in North Alabama, if we move from a part-time president pro tem to a residential bishop, even if we shared a bishop with another annual conference, we've got to increase our annual conference connectional funding.
Okay.
0.5% might do it, but it could go to 1%. Maybe it goes to 1.5%. I don't know. My point is, the general superintendency plan maxes the extra cost at 0.5%. The residential bishop Florida plan doesn't have that max. It could go higher. And so the potential cost is significantly greater, I think, under the Florida plan.
I'm glad you took the time to belabor that. That should be clear enough. I don't need to clarify any of that, but that is a worthy consideration.
Yep. So I'd rather go with the plan, not knowing the actual numbers for either plan.
Yeah.
I'd rather go with the one that caps it at 0.5% to my church, to my local church's budget.
Right on.
So that, I think, is a crucial piece in terms of minimizing the cost.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And then you had 2 other financial insights.
Yeah. Show me what they are again.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And so they're all kind of related. I think I've touched on those. Letter C, number 2, the annual conferences anticipate being able to keep a part-time president or conference superintendent, which keeps the cost down. And that's the point there for number 3.
Okay. Yep. Easier to keep giving low. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Yep. All right. Yeah, I included a slide on MythBusters because I really thought this was really helpful. Let me clarify what I mean by these things. So the biggest myth I think that's been perpetuated about, or just the thing that I think isn't quite accurate, let's put it that way, because I said this whole thing about not using uncharitable language. So
right, yeah.
I think the biggest inaccuracy is that the spiritual versus temporal dichotomy. So in the legislation for the General Superintendency Plan, bishops are explicitly said in 2 petitions to have spiritual and temporal authority.
That's true.
That's petition 25 and petition 27. That's paragraph 501 and paragraph 503. And conference superintendents are explicitly said to have spiritual and temporal leadership. That's petition 33 in the TLC plan, and it pertains to paragraph 507. So I really want to push back on, I don't know, in multiple documents I've seen, in your interview, in an email that went out on the president's blog in the Florida conference, this claim was made that the General Superintendency TLC plan separates falsely or unfair or it makes the false dichotomy between spiritual leadership for bishops and temporal leadership for conference superintendents. And I want to say it explicitly says both positions have both. Even if we ask bishops to lean into the spiritual leadership and conference superintendents to lean into the administration of the annual conference, they both still have both responsibilities.
And so this hasn't been, there aren't bad actors who've been confusing this. And you're absolutely right. I've read the petitions now, and you're absolutely right. That's the explicit language. But in some other publications from the GMC, there has been explicit language identifying the bishops with the spiritual leadership and the conference superintendents with the temporal leadership. And that's really unfortunate because that really has given this impression that now you're trying to undo.
Yeah, so I think this is an area, again, so we've been having this conversation for a long time now, looking at different models. This is a place where, as we put these in dialogue with each other, we can clarify what we mean, right? And clarify the rules. I think there's a really helpful analogy in the life of local church. So when I was pastoring, churches where I didn't have a lot of staff, I leaned into the spiritual leadership of the church, leadership development, preaching, Bible studies, vision casting, and I depended heavily on a finance chairperson and a trustee chairperson to help me with church admin, because those aren't my strengths anyway.
Yeah.
And so there was I was still involved in it. We spent a lot of time talking about it, but the execution of a lot of those things didn't fall to me. It fell to those committee chairs. I'm now in a church with more staff and there's more going on. It'd be a lot to ask a volunteer committee chair to do. So we have an executive pastor. He offers spiritual leadership. He's leading a Bible study yesterday, but he really leans into the administrative stuff, the property, the finance, bids, budgets, different people putting their own ministry budgets together. And that frees me up to lean into preaching and vision casting and leadership development and my relationship with lay leaders and mentoring people and discipleship, those kinds of things. I'm still involved. We get together. I'll throw in my 2 cents on administrative things. Had a conversation yesterday with a trustee chair about some property stuff, right? So both of us, me and the executive pastor, have spiritual and administrative temporal leadership. But he leans into the administrative temporal stuff, and I lean into the spiritual stuff, and that allows us to be our best in both cases.
So would I be right in interpreting the superintendency plan? What's on paper is both of these positions have authority in both realms, but then the unspoken part, the cultural part, is going to be this only works if the guys at the top lean one way and the guys in middle management lean another way.
Yeah. And I think that reconciles the two. Like you said, you've seen you got the official petitions and then you got these other documents.
Yeah.
I think that way of thinking about it is probably what we're getting at, even if
Okay.
we haven't said it really clearly. Right.
I think this makes it pretty clear. And so long as you're adequately speaking on their behalf, I think most people can sit comfortably with this.
If I've misrepresented what they're trying to say, I'm happy to be corrected.
I don't think you are.
That's the way
This is how it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's really a feasible, appropriate model that is analogous to local churches at every level,
Mm-hmm.
whether that delegation is picked up by lay leadership doing it on a volunteer basis or a staff person who's compensated. We still almost every local church I've ever served in delegates some of the administration work, and any pastor who has to do all of it is probably about to burn out.
Oh, sure. Yeah. All right. You had some more myths to bust.
Yeah. So the comment is sometimes made that the General Superintendency Plan takes bishops and makes them archbishops, and it takes conference superintendents and makes them bishops. That's just not true. What it does is it says, hey, in the UMC, we had bishops who were supposed to do the spiritual leadership and had to manage annual conferences. That ended up being a dysfunctional plan that didn't work out really well. And the thing that happened was bishops got so involved in annual conference management that there really wasn't a lot of time left for the spiritual leadership, because if you got paperwork and you've got deadlines, that's got to be done. And maybe you've crowded out some of the time for reading and study and prayer that you need to do as well, even though there's not a deadline on your daily devotion, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're not taking conference superintendents and making them bishops. We're not taking bishops and making them archbishops. We're taking bishops, creating a new administrative office, and delegating some of the authority to them for local conference management. Mm-hmm. So it makes a nice tagline: bishops become archbishops, conference superintendents become bishops. But it's not accurate. It's a new office that allows us to delegate some of the admin to local conference superintendents, so that our bishops have the time they need to pray together, to read, to study, to travel around, to focus on teaching. I know some conferences now are getting ready to host extended time with our bishops, with Bishop Webb, to come and visit and spend several days doing a teaching tour around the annual conference. Mm-hmm. Bishop Jones has been here in Birmingham to do teaching with us, and so to preach on Sunday and to be a part of a conference. So I think what we see now is we've got a model where our bishops have the space to lean into this vision casting and this theological shepherding missing. Mm-hmm. And if we overload them with administration, which is what the regional Florida plan does, we're going to lose that. That's my concern.
I don't know if you've anticipated this line, but it seems to me that the GMC is currently in a period where our theology has not been firmly established, and it's really not until 2026 that we can really have anyone adequately represent that. And so one of the things that you've answered in one of your articles is the concern that this is moving a bit too fast. What do you say to someone like me who's not really comfortable with people representing the theological and doctrinal part of our tradition until it's more firmly established?
I would let me ask you a question. What if it's not, what's not established?
So the things that I'm picking up on that are not established yet are our theology as it relates to church growth versus discipleship, and if those things are in tension, if at all. The class stuff, the concern for the poor, the rural, the small, I don't think that's been defined. I don't think it's been clarified if we are going to be primarily concerned with holiness and exclusivity, or if we're going to be primarily concerned with inclusivity and bringing everybody in. I don't think it's been established how it is that we understand trust and authority to operate within our body and what is right for our leadership to ask for. These are just things off the top of my head. I'm sure there are 4 or 5 others. So when you have, okay, just for example, one of the episcopacy candidates, I was watching an interview the other day, said that people are entitled to God's grace or forgiveness or salvation. I forget what it was, but that word of entitlement really bothers me. I would be very uncomfortable with someone being elected to the bishop's office who is traveling around saying, you are entitled to God's forgiveness. And until we get a real clear theological framework, I think I'm much more comfortable for the next 2 years just having people holding it all together rather than with the confidence and trust of the denomination going and casting a vision for what Wesleyanism and Methodism is supposed to be. I still think our leadership is a bit squishy compared to where we need to be, and I think that we're only going to be able to firm that up over 2 years of intentionally reclaiming our heritage and turning up the heat on it. So what do you think about that, brother?
Yeah, so I think, I heard that same interview, and that word sort of notched for me too. And my response was more, I'd love to kind of ask a question to clarify. And if we leaned in and kind of said, is entitlement really the right word? Well, taken this way,
categorically no. That's so un-Wesleyan. Yeah.
So I would agree that no one is entitled to grace. That's the point. But I wonder, but I also know that when I'm in a conversation and I'm speaking off the cuff, I sometimes misspeak.
Oh, sure.
And so that posture of trust, because I know these candidates and I followed their ministries for a long time. I imagine if we sat down and kind of pressed through that, we'd probably get to a place of clarity and agreement. So I'm not, maybe wasn't quite as worried about that, and I'd be happy to have that conversation as well. Yeah, I think what I envision with the bishop is our historic Methodist doctrine and theological distinctives, I think, are established.
Okay, so let's just I did a poor job on that. When you read John Wesley's sermons, one of the things that's abundantly clear is we are bad. We're born bad. We're sinners. We're deserving of death, damnation, suffering. That is throughout his sermons. It's uniform throughout early Methodist belief. I would consider that core and key with Methodism. I'm not sure. Huh?
I do too.
Okay, so I'm not sure that all of our bishops' candidates or even our current bishops are comfortable speaking in those terms. And I would really like it if we could really beef that up where nobody can lead and speak on behalf of our denomination unless they're comfortable speaking to the condemnation that awaits for all outside of Christ.
Yeah. I understand that. I'd be really surprised, articulated that way, I'd be really surprised if our Episcopal candidates wouldn't generally agree with what you said.
So I think most would agree, but also I think most are not going to talk about it publicly. That they're not going to lead with that's something that they'll say behind closed doors, but they're not going to get out in front of 1,000 people, especially unconverted people, and say, without Jesus, you are lost. You are damned. Yeah. You are not basically good. You are basically bad, and you need Jesus. Early Methodists would have done that without batting an eye, but we've changed, and so we need to go back, in my opinion. And I think we could if we had a 2-year liminal period of reclaiming our theology and then electing people that represent that. But if we put people forward now, I think it is a lot more UMC 2.0 than we'd like to think.
So you're saying the Florida plan gives us space to nail that kind of stuff down and clarify it?
In that sense, yes. So in my mind, I guess beggars can't be choosers, and I'm a beggar, but if I were king of the Global Methodists, what we would do is we would have a 2-year liminal period where we don't put any more bishops in charge, and then we would adopt something like the Superintendency Plan, where you do have general superintendents, but we just don't put them in place to represent the whole body until we've established our theology more firmly.
Yeah, so what I was thinking was you're not going to get a huge shift on those kinds of things in 2 years.
So I'm more optimistic than you on that, and you're more optimistic than me on if I sat down with these people, we'd come to a place of agreement. So that's okay.
Well, here, let me finish the thought. So
do it.
Like, we're not going to sort out the courage to preach Wesley's Doctrine of Original Sin in the sermon in which he said, in his natural state, man would rather love a rock than God. One of my favorite John Wesley quotes that I always cite when I'm preaching on the doctrine of sin. Like that's Wesley. That's what he says. In our natural state, apart from the grace of God, we'd rather love a rock.
Oh yeah, depravity is core and key. Yes.
So that's there. So I don't expect the courage to say that publicly to develop corporate like broadly in 2 years.
No, not broadly.
Now, and I'm not assuming, like, I haven't watched like I don't know, every one of these candidates probably has years of sermons online. Like, go back, we can go back, look at their body of work and see what kind of thing what they said. And I think folks who are interested should do that.
Sure.
So I don't want to put words in their mouth. I don't want to make assumptions about their theology in that way. I would, based on, I've listened to all of the interviews that have come out so far, and I would have questions for all of them, right? Based on some of the comments that have been said, and so like, I get that we have minor theological, or not minor, but we all articulate things a little differently. And it requires conversations like this, where we sit down and say, all right, tell me what you mean by that. Is that really the word you meant to use? Could that be misunderstood? Could we move it? Could we pick a different word that helps us get it more clearly? I think those are important questions. So let me back up. So under the Florida plan, if that's adopted, you get your 2-year hiatus. Mm-hmm. Then you have to elect 30, potentially 30 or more bishops, right? Yeah. So instead of 8 that may or may not articulate things the way you want them to, you're going to have dozens.
That's right.
Who may or may not articulate things the way you want them to.
Right. Exactly.
Right? And we could even have, I think we expect potentially by 2026 to have more than 40 annual conferences.
Oh, sure. Probably. Yeah.
So like, sure, some of them will share, but if they didn't, under the Florida plan, you've got an assembly of bishops with 40 people on it.
Well, by design, the Florida plan does not have a small group of powerful leaders that are speaking with one voice and heading in one direction. You have much more of a confederacy that has much more variety regionally. So
it depends on how you define power. I don't see the general superintendency plan as lodging that much power with the assembly of bishops. Institutional power. They have
institutional power. Yeah, it's a question of what is the nature of power in the GMC and how does it work?
Influence.
They have
a lot of influence.
And when they speak with one voice on behalf of the whole body, that's not something that the Florida plan really provides for, but it's something that the superintendency plan not only provides for but expects, which when we haven't had a period of earning trust back is very scary to people like me who imagine that we can have some kind of squishy people get the office and then publish a lot of documents that seem to say something but still make room for everybody.
I have to say this.
Go ahead.
I don't think our candidates are squishy. I really don't. These are not folks who have developed the influence that they've developed for trying to play both sides of the aisle. They're not. They're all people who have sacrificed, I think, and been targeted. Maybe not all equally, but they're folks who have held on to an evangelical Methodism. Specifically the interview you have in mind there. You're talking about folks who are in ministry, like caring for people who are like deeply broken and deeply in rebellion against God and deeply lost. And there's this abundance of grace that has helped people come out of that into flourishing and wholeness. So like, I wouldn't use, would I want some clarity on some things? Yes. Sure. But that's pretty much, I want clarity from everyone. That's part of my gig. But I don't
want to go too far with the squishy
I don't think
thing.
they're theologically. I don't think any of our candidates are theologically squishy. I think they're there because they're probably.
The term squishy is subject. It's relative. It's a relative term. Like according to some people, we would all be squishes. Even like I would be considered a squish. Just depending on where your starting point is. But there has to be an awareness coming out of the UMC of this tendency that happens with people who are legit, who then get the bishop's office, and suddenly you can't count on them anymore. something changes. And we haven't really fully accounted for that or understood that. But I do think something, I mean, not to beat a dead horse, but the doctrine of original sin, I really do think that's the primary issue on which I turn on all this. And I would be very surprised if a single one of the Episcopal candidates that you showed me had anything resembling a hellfire and brimstone sermon that has been recorded. And so in that respect,
the only way to find out, you got to go look for it.
Right. Well, I'm going to outsource that. People watching this, if you have a sermon from any of the candidates that resembles an old school Methodist hellfire and brimstone sermon, I would love to see it. I'm going to throw my weight behind that candidate. So maybe that candidate won't want my support, but we'll see. Anyway, we've gotten derailed long enough. I appreciate you being gracious with me. So here's where we are.
Yeah, I think we've done that one. So
okay.
The Archbishop thing is just not a helpful. It's just not a helpful way to talk, and it's not true.
Okay.
Yep. So what is the role of bishops under this General Superintendency Plan? I put the Francis Asbury model in there because I think this is really what it's trying to do. Bishop Scott Jones makes that case, as I said, in his material for Reconstructing Methodism. So we have non-residential traveling bishops. That means that our bishops are not located and assigned to individual conferences where their authority hits the boundary of that one conference, and that's it, right? They travel across conferences, and I think the plan is that if the interim bishops are elected under the TLC plan for 2 years, they're going to be part-time and have 4, maybe 6 annual conferences. Bishop Jones and Bishop Webb will be the 2 full-time bishops, and they will have 8 apiece. That's kind of the general idea. And so each one of these folks travels around to each of those conferences, teaching, offering training, like training the cabinet, training the conference superintendent, teaching in the churches, all those kinds of things. And that's what it means for them to be letter B here, spiritual leaders and theological shepherds of the church, instead of conference administrators, right? Which is what our experience was in the UMC. Mm-hmm. They have general oversight of the church and its mission. It's their job to guard the faith, order, and doctrine of the church. They lead both spiritually and temporally. I do find the word temporal to be kind of an unhelpful word. I wish that it was not in the legislation.
But it spiritual. Is historical, isn't it?
I don't know. I mean, it's unclear, whatever it is. Like, why do we think spiritual matters are not time bound?
Yeah, well, right? And I think, yeah, temporal. Yeah, it's not an exact term. I think it is a historical term, and we're really kind of taking it out of context. Yeah. But it is making clear the administrative paperwork duties and stuff are tied with it.
The word administrative would have been a much clearer term.
Yeah.
Right. So theological leadership, administrative leadership. Either way, the bishops have that at the general church level, and they're bishops of the whole church, not just one annual conference. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that the candidates who are up for being elected to bishop should have a strong record of ministry in terms of evangelism and discipleship. So are they reaching new people for Jesus, and are the people they reach growing in Christ likeness? So those
and the body responsible for assessing that, would that be the General Committee on Episcopacy, or would it be the Connectional Council? I forget.
I think it's they are accountable, I think, to the General Superintendent. Yeah, the General Committee on Superintendency. Yep.
Episcopacy. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's not the thing that replaces the TLC.
That's the Connectional Council.
Yeah. There's a global committee in the Episcopacy that is in view.
Yeah. Okay.
They'll be elected first over the next 2 years. We're supposed to elect 6 interim bishops. I think I just mentioned this, serving in a part-time role. Some of them are retired. At least one of them intends to stay on as the pastor of the church. He's going to have a lot of staff support, I think. And then Webb and Jones are full-time. Go to the next one. The continuing bishops that will be elected in 2026. The General Committee on the Episcopacy has to recommend the number to be elected. The way it's drawn up now, they may serve a maximum of 2 6-year terms, and the second term is not a given. They've got to actually stand and be elected to receive the second term, right? So let's say they're not a public heretic, but they're not doing a great job. They don't automatically get another term. They've got to be reelected. And if we don't have confidence in their leadership, I don't think they will be. And then they're appointed or assigned by this general committee on the episcopacy to the various annual conferences. They are compensated at the level of the general church. We already discussed this, so we don't have to get heavy into that. But your church, every local church in the connection already gives 1% of their operating expenses to the general church. If we fund bishops through the general church, that can only go up another 0.5%.
Yeah. For those who are curious, point 5 was they are assigned to their area by the General Committee on Episcopacy. The Florida plan, as I understood it, presented by J. Therrell, was the General Conference elects them, they are put into a pool, and then each annual conference gets to pick their own out of that pool. And so this is different in that the annual conferences don't choose, nor the Episcopal areas. Rather, this is done by a committee that ideally is balanced well to look at the missional needs of each area and the giftings and graces of each candidate.
Well, I think too, again, remember, this is a very different vision of the episcopacy than what we've had before.
Right.
So at one level, every one of them ought to be able to offer leadership in any annual conference.
Right.
Because they're bishops of the whole church. Right. So whomever is elected, it's not a matter of the primary question is not, because we're not looking for residential bishops who manage the affairs of an annual conference. The primary question is not, is this bishop a good fit for us? Right? The primary question is this bishop a good fit for the church as a whole? And if they are, then they ought to be able to spend some of their time in our annual conference teaching and training and offering spiritual leadership. And we should have the confidence of that, right? So I think that question of we want to say in who our bishop is, right, goes back to a United Methodist, the angst we have in well, we got this bishop and maybe they're a liberal and they don't jive with our annual conference. And it feels antagonistic. And sometimes the appointment process feels punitive, right? Well, none of those questions are relevant to the general superintendency plan because the bishops aren't doing that kind of work. And so I would want to say, assuming whoever becomes elected, the 8 bishops, I would hope that I would be happy with any of them being assigned to our annual conference.
Yeah, that's what we'd hope. One of the things Reverend Therrell said in his interview, he'd seen an interview with one of the Episcopal candidates saying that he anticipated spending only under 20 days a year in many of his annual conferences. I didn't know which interview. I didn't have the courage to ask who said that. What interview was that?
Well, it was before the stuff with the video interviews that Andy Miller's doing. I want to say he said that to you.
Yeah.
But your podcast aired before any of those, so I have no idea.
That would have been one of the ones with Diane, the communications director, I guess. But
yeah, I didn't see it, but that seems. I mean, I don't have a firm number on how much time any of the candidates are planning to spend in each conference, but if you've got 4 to 6, you could probably manage more than 8 days.
I mean, I would like to think the expectation would be if you're spread out over 4 to 6 areas, then you're spending at least a month in each place per year.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. I mean, I think Jeff Greenway said in his interview, I just listened to that yesterday, that Bishop Webb is about to spend 5 days in their conference doing a teaching tour, right? So that's one visit, and you're going to get 5 days there. So I would imagine, 8 days. I would want to ask for some clarification. All right, let's talk through that a little bit. What are the expectations? What are we looking at here?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think too, right? Annual conferences are going to have the ability to say, hey, this bishop really didn't spend enough time with us, and we don't think they should be reelected.
I'm glad you clarified that for folks. If they're thinking that the TLC plan only guarantees 8 to 10 days, that is not going to be satisfactory for.
That doesn't seem that seems like that just doesn't seem accurate to me.
Okay.
I could be wrong. Where were we? Oh yeah, so now we're on the role of the conference superintendent. So the TLC plan, or the General Superintendency Plan, creates a conference administrator called the conference superintendent. And this new role is a lot of the things that bishops in the UMC have done in the past gets delegated to the conference superintendent. They provide spiritual and temporal leadership in the annual conference. That's petition 33, paragraph 507. And they have oversight in annual conference fiscal, financial operations. They give oversight to fair process for clergy and family in administrative and judicial processes. So if a complaint is filed against a clergy person, that gets adjudicated there first, and you follow the rules for handling that. They supervise the cabinet. They give the highest level, level of oversight with the presiding elders to the collaborative appointment making process that we have. And then once those decisions are made, they go to the bishop to be fixed. Generally, the bishops are, taking the recommendations of the cabinet and the conference superintendent there, but they could ask the bishop to get more involved if they wanted to.
All right. I have no questions about that. That seems pretty clear to me.
This is where I want to emphasize, and we don't have to spend a lot of time here because we leaned into it earlier, but I think it's helpful to remember this is about delegating. We had bishops in the UMC that were doing too much, so we're delegating some of the responsibilities to local conference administrators to free up the bishops to really lean into the theological leadership of the church. That doesn't mean the conference superintendent doesn't offer spiritual leadership. They can offer as much as they'd like to. They have the platform at annual conference and access to the pastors and churches. But what we're asking them to do is ensure the faithful administration of the annual conference. That's what we need superintendents to do.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about how we can improve the general superintendency plan. Number one, Jay made this point. I think he is absolutely right. Right now, the general superintendency plan allows complaints against bishops to be referred from the Committee on General Superintendency or Episcopacy to the Council of Assembly of Bishops. Mm-hmm. That needs to change. The Assembly of Bishops does not need to adjudicate any complaint against any bishop in its own body. This is the foxes guarding the henhouse thing that we would talk about. So I'd have to go back and look at the exact legislation, but
I looked at it this morning. It's just in cases that are not abuse, it goes to the Assembly of Bishops. If it's abuse, then it stays in the Committee on Episcopacy. But you and I would be of the same mind. It all needs to stay within the Committee on Episcopacy. Yeah. Okay.
Nothing needs to be referred. And this the closer it looks to a local church, the better, right? So like if a complaint is made against a clergy person, right, SPR will go to the bishop, will go to the conference, the cabinet, like that goes, SPR has the first level of oversight, and then the cabinet and the judicial things there. A pastor doesn't go to the other pastors first for their I think Jay is absolutely right. That can be fixed. It can probably be fixed in committee so that it's right when it gets to the floor. And I think we would be wise to do that.
Okay.
One of the candidates mentioned this, I think it was Ryan Barnett in his interview with Andy Miller said, right now the general superintendency plan has the bishop appoints the conference superintendent. I think it would be better, and this is basically what Ryan said, if the annual conference could collaborate with the bishop on that and say, hey, here's 3 folks that we think would be great for this, pick one. And if the bishop said, well, I don't really like any of these, then we come back and we pick a few more until we figure that out. So I think that helps avoid this idea, like conference superintendents don't need to just be like the bishop's hatchet person on the ground, right? Or the bishop's butler in the annual conference, right? The GMs with clergy deployment, churches have a lot more collaborative input in the consultation process with the cabinet. We need that with the conference superintendent bishop relationship as well. So I think that could easily be fixed and strengthen the plan. And then the last one there is, I don't remember seeing anything in the legislation that the conference superintendent could be a part-time position. We should clarify that annual conferences can make that decision if they want. At least I was with some folks yesterday and they named off 6 or 7 conferences that have a part-time president pro tem. We're doing that because we it works for us, keeps the cost down, maximum flexibility. If you want a full-time conference superintendent, you want to pay that salary, by all means, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
If you want, the part-time thing, let's codify that, get that language in there, and give conferences the flexibility they need.
Right on.
We've probably talked about most of these along the way, but we can mention them quickly. Problems I see with the Florida plan, we've already talked about the cost. It's hard for me to imagine 40 bishops being cheaper than 8 bishops. I don't know how that works. Even with the travel that's required, it's hard for me to imagine 40 bishops being cheaper than 8 bishops.
Well, so what I think Therrell would say is, assuming that the conference superintendents are full-time positions, then they would take the place of those 40 bishops, and then you have these 8 or 9 other people atop them, and that's how he does that math. And you're saying, I hear you, is that they can be part-time, and that could really offset a lot of the costs. But even so, you've already said that's a new administrative position that doesn't exist in the Florida plan. So that money, that still costs money.
Yeah. So the conference superintendents don't have to be lots more expensive, right? They range, from the basic stipend for a presiding elder to other appropriate part-time salaries. In North Alabama, if we shifted from a part-time president pro tem or conference superintendent to a full-time residential bishop, it would radically disrupt the way we do ministry here.
Yeah.
Like that. And that's all, it's a given.
Yeah.
We would significantly, and even sharing with 1 or 2 other conferences would multiply the administrative expense significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think anybody in North Alabama wants the residential bishop plan. And so that's why we're talking about this conference. The general superintendency creates that flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you want the part-time administrator, you can do it. If you want a full-time administrator, that's your business. You can do it. The Florida plan does not give us that kind of flexibility.
Well, and you said in strengthening the plan, they need to be more explicit about that flexibility.
That's right. Yep.
So assuming they are explicit about it, then yes, that's an obvious strength of the superintendency plan. Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So I just think one of the problems with the Florida plan, letter C there, is that like the UMC, it invests bishops with too much administrative responsibility that does not leave sufficient time for spiritual leadership, right? So all through the New Testament, as the church grows, you see the delegation of administrative responsibility as early as Acts 6, right? So you got all of a sudden there are widows that need to be fed and there's some conflict, and the apostles basically say, hey, we can't skimp on praying and the ministry of the word. So we're going to recruit some folks to handle the food distribution. That's a ministry. We're not saying it's not a ministry, but there's some administrative things that need to happen there. Somebody's got to keep a tally of who's getting what and how it's getting spread out. We got to delegate that so that we can lean into the spiritual leadership. This is the general superintendency plan is analogous to that. Titus chapter 1, verse 5, Paul says to Titus, you go and appoint elders in every town on Crete. Yeah, he's on an island of Crete in the Mediterranean, 20 or so towns on the island in the first century. Titus has that local or that regional administrative job of working with the churches to secure their pastoral leadership. Paul is at the top of the level, traveling around broadly across the Mediterranean region, the Roman Empire, advising, counseling the local leaders, right? A tiered level of you've got a hierarchical 3 tiers of leadership, Paul at the top, Titus doing the regional admin, and then the local pastors. The general superintendency gives us that sort of thing. Bishops, conference superintendents, local pastors, and it delegates appropriately leadership and administration across that hierarchy. So that's why I think it's a very biblically based plan.
Anticipating Therrell's retort to that, he would say, okay, in the Bible you have 3. You have bishop, elder, people on the ground. But here, what the TLC plan does is bishop, conference superintendent, elder, people on the ground. It creates an artificial 4th category of conference superintendent.
No. So I'm saying Titus functions like the conference superintendent and Paul functions like the bishop.
Oh, okay. So Titus is like the conference superintendent over the pastors on Crete who are over the... Okay. I misunderstood you. Thank you.
So Paul, and again, I don't want to be anachronistic. This is an analogy,
Yes.
right? We don't want to assume that, the first century was more structured than it is.
Right.
It doesn't give us specific, like, thou shalt do this in your polity kinds of sentences.
Sure. Right.
But Paul is functioning analogously to the traveling bishop.
I understand now. Yes.
Who sends Titus to Crete and Timothy to Ephesus, and he gives them advice. He's writing letters. He's teaching. He visits from time to time to check in on everybody, make sure things are going well. If there's a really complicated problem, he gets involved in it. But otherwise, the evidence looks like most of the admin is not happening at Paul's level. And so he sends these regional administrators that I'm arguing are analogous to the conference superintendent.
Yeah. Okay, I hear you now.
Titus is on Crete, and he's got, a couple dozen churches probably. And it's his job to collaborate with those churches and make sure that they have appropriate pastoral leadership.
Yeah, that makes sense to me now. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. So I also think just the potential for having more than 30 bishops in 2 years is like way too fast.
Okay. Yeah.
I think David Donham made this point in a Firebrand article first. I agree with it entirely. Of these two plans, which one is hardest to fix? Which one is hardest to roll back? Let's say we get into the Florida plan 12 years from now and we're like, wow, bishops in every conference is not working out the way we wanted it to. It's very hard to eliminate full-time jobs. Yes. 12 years down the road with the general superintendency plan, we got 8 or 9 bishops and we go, we could use a few more.
Yeah.
Let's have that conversation. That's an easy fix. We elect a few more bishops and each one gets fewer conferences. As we're figuring this thing out, the plan with the least liability in that way is the general superintendency plan. I do not want to be in a situation in 2 years where we potentially have 36 bishops. Yeah. I'd much rather have 8 or 9, and let's see how that goes. And if we need to expand it later, we can. But once we expand it, it's going to be almost impossible, I think, to pull that back. We're not going to go from 30 bishops to 8. That seems very unlikely to me.
Yeah.
And so, the argument from Florida plan advocates is that general superintendency moves too fast because we elect bishops in 2024. Well, I would argue, let's see where we are in 2028 and which plan moves too fast. Well, in 2028, we could have 36 bishops, and that's a lot of folks like at the highest level.
Yeah.
Under the general superintendency plan, we've got 8 or 9 maybe, and our top level institutional footprint is a lot smaller. So that's, I think, the best way to come at it. I think the Florida plan is the quickest path to the biggest bureaucracy. Admittedly, bureaucracy is kind of a pejorative term in all discourse. But this idea that, the essentialships is going to be a bureaucratic body. And if it's got 30 people on it, that's a lot of bureaucracy. And if it's got 8, that's a lot less.
That's the end of the presentation that you've got for us. So we covered a lot of ground, and we dealt with some theology and some theory, and then we've dealt with some of the particulars of the plan. Of course, there are many more particulars of the plan and a lot more theology that we could get into it. But I hope this has been a helpful time of reflection for delegates in particular who decided to spend time with us and think through this. And, I'd like to think that people on the other side have thought that this is pretty fair as well. I had been hoping to keep this to an hour, and we already went over, and I didn't even get to bring in Ryan Danker's recent article and some of the critiques he has on the GMC and how it's approaching these things in the episcopacy. So maybe that's a later conversation, but for the time being, I don't know that article has a big role to play. We have some specific proposals on the table that we need to take seriously, and it's not necessarily... this question you posed, what's easier to undo, is a relevant question. I had an Army buddy who's a chaplain. He told me one time, a plan is something you deviate from. And I found that really helpful in the local church context, where you put something forward, but you hold it lightly. in case it needs to be augmented according to the needs on the ground and the prompting of the Spirit. And it seems to me that that's the same attitude that we should have right now around the episcopacy.
I think that's right. And if you look at the general superintendency plan, like functionally, it's very similar to what's happening right now. We've got 2 bishops, and every conference has a president pro tem. And so we've been doing it for 2 years, and I guess for about 2 years now. And it's going pretty well, I think. Mm-hmm. I haven't heard a lot of complaints about the president pro tem structure. I think everybody's really pleased with how Bishop Jones and Bishop Webb are conducting themselves.
They have done quite well.
Yeah, I think so. And so the general superintendency plan says, all right, let's give that another 2 years. Let's take some of the load off Bishops Jones and Webb, because we need more than 2 bishops, but probably not more than 10.
Yeah.
Right. And so let's we're doing it. It's going pretty well so far. Let's do it for another 2 years, and that'll give us a little more time. It'll get more people time to get in, more conferences around in the global South and Africa to have a say. And then, we can elect more bishops in 2 years. If we decide along the way that it's not going well and we really need more, that can happen. But the Florida plan gets us to much more really, really fast. And that's the thing that concerns me perhaps the most.
All valid reflections. I appreciate you reaching out to me and being willing to do this. I think it's very much needed for the present moment. And what I hope is abundantly clear to everybody who watches this and the Therrell interview is tons of prayer and prep have gone into both plans. People who love Jesus and fear the Lord rightly are advocates of both plans. This is not anything close to a salvation issue. This is just figuring out what model we want to go forward with. So thank you for balancing the conversation, Matt. Yeah,
thanks for hosting this. And I'll end by saying, if the Florida plan is selected and implemented, I'm on board 100%.
Awesome.
Like for me,
and I think Jay said something similar.
Yeah, whatever the church decides, that's what we do.
Amen.
So I'm excited about the future on that.
Would you? I've been having my guests close out with praying for the audience. Would you mind praying for those who spent time with us?
Happy to. Let's pray together. Our God and Father, we do give thanks that your grace comes to us in our undeserving state, in a state of utter desperation. We are lost without you, O Lord, and we give thanks that you come with an abundance of kindness and mercy. And now we pray, Lord, for listeners, and we pray especially for General Conference delegates, Convening Conference delegates, that you give us wisdom as we do the work before us. You have entrusted to the people called Global Methodist a mission, the gospel, and the mission of the church to bring the good news to our neighbors in the nations. Our prayer is that you grant us grace to do that well and wisely, and that you grant us the wisdom to implement the best structures to serve the mission instead of the other way around. We give thanks in Christ's name, in the power of your Spirit. Amen.
Amen. I'm not remembering. Are you a delegate?
I'm an alternate on the North Alabama, so I'll be there. May get a chance to sit on the seat.
That'll be awesome. I'm so excited for you and for the rest of the crew that's going to be there. Thank you for serving. And friends, thank you for being a part of this conversation. I love being able to host stuff and talk to people like Matt. So I hope it's been a blessing for you. And if you haven't yet, you need to make sure you've subscribed. Go ahead and like this so that other people see it. And I'll see you next time. Take care, guys.